Greetings, students, and welcome to our next lecture entitled Libertarianism, A Closer Examination. I'm Dr. Traylor. Let's get started. All right, so in this lecture, we're basically looking more closely at the idea of libertarianism or liberalism, which are typically used interchangeably. We're going to be looking at the different aspects of liberalism that basically grew from the ideas of John Locke's political thoughts in the early modern period, okay? So that being said, we're going to both define it more specifically, libertarianism or liberalism, so that you can have a general overview again and understand Locke's idea. But we're also going to look at the different variations that have grown from his initial ideas that we can see in libertarian views or liberalism today. All right, that being said, let's jump in. All right, so Locke is considered the father of liberalism, okay? Because much of his political theory, as we've covered, essentially aligns with many of the libertarian or liberalism ideas today, all right? Additionally, the ideas set forth by Locke are often used as a base for contemporary libertarian views, all right? I specifically gave you examples of how U.S. policy or important U.S. documents such as Declaration of Independence or the Constitution are very much indebted to Locke's ideas, okay? So this lecture will basically explore these ideas in more detail. Now, liberalism, generally speaking, in the classical sense as it was laid out by Locke, liberalism has a strong focus on liberty or freedom, right? Ideas such as freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, freedom of press, freedom of ownership, which was essential for Locke's theory, right? Essential, essentially, freedom of ownership is also tied to economic freedoms and this notion of property that we saw strongly come through strongly in Locke's theory. All right. So individuals that prescribe to this version of political thought essentially feel that social existence should be left up to the individual or the person. And basically, there should be little to no coercion from the state. Okay, how much influence the state has kind of depends on the brand of liberalism we're talking about. Now, here's a specific example to look at. Liberalism promotes ideas such as private charity versus a welfare system within a state, okay? So this means that someone who is strongly aligned with Locke's ideas would essentially argue that I can choose to give my money to help others because again, I'm exercising my own liberty or freedom to, but I should not be forced by the state to give any of my money or even a portion of my taxes to help other people, okay? So again, my freedoms as an individual should not be impeded on by the state under this view. Now, let's break this down a little bit more, okay? There's negative liberty and positive liberty, okay? Negative liberty is essentially the absence of external roadblocks or limits on what one can do, meaning no other person or even the law can basically stop you from your action, okay? There's no barriers to you doing what you need to do and living freely within a given society, okay? Now, positive liberty, on the other hand, is the internal capacity to act as you wish, thus an absence of internal roadblocks or limits on what you can do, okay, coming from within. Now, let's look at an example of both of these played out, all right? So in example one, let's imagine that Mike wishes to hunt deer on his family vacation, okay? So if we view this under negative liberty, Mike is free to hunt deer as long as no one externally is actively preventing him from doing so, okay? Thus, in this case, there's an absence of external limits on Mike's freedom to hunt, okay? However, his negative freedoms would be violated if someone, for example, stole his hunting gear or a pro animal group kidnapped him to save the deer, right? We often see this even in the case of abortion. Basically, it would be the same essential idea. You are free to essentially have an abortion, there's no roadblocks, but there's also cases where you've seen anti-abortion groups stand in front of clinics and prevent people from doing so. All right. Example two. Imagine that Mike wants to hunt deer on his family vacation, but in this case, he can't afford the extra hunting gear. Or he's sick and he needs medical care, so thus basically he can't vacation at all. In this case, there's no external person or law basically preventing Mike from hunting, but his internal capacity to fulfill his desires is essentially restricting his positive liberty or freedoms in this case. All right. So, why does this matter? So, if we put these two ideas into the context of a state or society, which is what we've been talking about this unit, right? In terms of what obligation or powers the state should have in relation to liberalism or to the people, right? It's assumed under liberalism thought that the state should protect Mike's negative liberties by preventing pro animal groups from kidnapping him or at least prosecuting someone if they stole his hunting gear, right? So, in this sense, his freedoms are protected because those roadblocks are removed by the state. That is where the state, under liberalism, can essentially step in, all right? On the other hand, one could view that the state's job is to promote Mike's positive liberty by providing quality health care in the second situation to fix his illness, or even using tax money to assure that Mike has monetary needs to basically go hunting if he so desires, right? In this view, this would assure that Jack is both free from external constraints to pursue his wishes, but also has the resources to keep up his internal capacity to attain them, okay, to fulfill his desires. Now, although libertarians are often in favor of protecting negative liberties, they're often against the state acting on behalf of positive liberties because, as you see in this example, acting on behalf of positive liberties, it often entails impinging on the freedoms of other people to do so. For example, taking the tax money from others to build a healthcare system that works for all so that Mike can go. Or essentially using tax resources to make sure that Mike has enough money to basically have his basic desires met of going on a vacation in general. Okay. Now, let's take one more look at this, okay? What liberalism, under this example that I just provided you, is essentially saying is that yes, I want the state to assure that there are as few limits as possible in place to prevent me from doing what I wish to do. However, it's set up basically it's set up to for everyone to basically use their own capacity to get their needs met, okay? So the liberalist in this particular case, or someone who believes strongly in libertarianism, believes I don't want roadblocks to my freedoms. However, every single individual, it's up to them internally when we think of the positive liberties, right? For them to kind of carry their own weight, all right? It's the notion of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So thus, if we have a scenario or a society in which those without bootstraps in the first place, right, those without means at all, they're essentially dead weight within a libertarian system, okay? Because the idea is that if you lack the capacity to freely get what you need, then basically it shouldn't be on the state or on the rest of us to get it for you. And by the state interfering and assuring you get your proper, if it was the hunting in the example I gave, or even education or healthcare, etc., it will basically somehow negatively affect my freedom by doing so. So I have to give extra money out of my paycheck in order to assure that you get proper education because you can't use your positive liberties in which to do so for yourself. This is essentially the liberal idea in practice, or liberalism in practice, in the classical sense, but it also helps you again distinguish between negative liberties and positive liberties and the libertarian's view on each and how they kind of play themselves out in application. Okay, so hopefully that example helped you clear that up. Now, let's move on. There's various types of libertarianism, okay? There's rights libertarianism, consequentialist libertarianism, left libertarianism, and right wing, we'll say that libertarianism, so you can differentiate it from rights libertarianism. So, rights libertarianism is probably the closest to how John Locke intended to lay things out, okay? It's essentially the idea that people should be free to do as they wish and exercise their rights as long as they don't impede on others, okay? Rights libertarianism also recognizes the need for limited government intervention to protect basic rights of, again, life, liberty, and property. This is almost exactly how Locke envisioned things, okay? So those who prescribe to rights libertarianism are very much, almost 100% aligned with how Locke envisioned an ideal social society. Now, let's move on. Consequentialist libertarianism. If we think of consequentialist, what immediately comes to mind? Utility, utilitarianism, right? That we covered previously in the ethics section, okay? So, consequentialist libertarianism is essentially aligned with rights libertarianism, but they argue from a different standpoint. They give different justification for why it's necessary for the state to only have a limited hand in things, okay? They view the need for freedom to exercise their rights without intervention as basically being for the greater good or promoting overall human happiness, okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that libertarianism does not consider that their right to freely exercise their will as they wish may, in fact, technically impose on others, okay? For example, the working poor who within a true libertarian system might get thrown under the bus here, okay? They don't necessarily consider their greater good within the equation. So, an example of this would essentially be, say I own a company, okay, and I choose to pay my workers poorly because I want to basically capitalize on my company and make as much money as possible. Now, while I prosper under libertarianism, the government should not interfere and force me to pay a living wage or to pay my workers more. Because by doing so, what's happening? They're essentially impeding on my rights, right? On my freedom, okay? However, it's not considered by basically the from the libertarian view that by underpaying workers, you're in some way impeding on their right to fair pay. Okay. The libertarianism response to this would be, well, you know what? They should use their internal capacity, right? Their positive liberties to start their own business if they don't like it. No one is stopping them within this free society. Okay. So this again is kind of the theory in a practical application to kind of make it more real for you and to see. You may hear this perspective and basically say, yeah, that's absolutely right, which means you likely align with Locke's view or libertarian views. On the other hand, you may say, well, no, that's totally problematic and want to see things from another political perspective. Okay. Now, let's move on to left or left wing libertarianism. All right. These individuals basically value individual liberty, but they combine it with egalitarian views. There's some notion of equality that a strict libertarian or liberalism doesn't necessarily entail, okay? So they're not against individual liberties. However, they feel that natural resources should be shared to assure that our freedom is basically not a detriment to others. So they believe in freedom, but they believe in freedom with a caveat, freedom that truly does not come at the cost of other people. Okay. So they feel every individual is essentially entitled to equal share of resources, even if they don't possess the capacity to get it for themselves. So with left wing libertarianism, they may limit government's hand to some extent, that government can overreach, but they're going to use the government more than typical classical Lockean view, right? Because they're going to let the government step in to assure that those natural resources are more equally spread out, if you will. Okay, whereas in true libertarianism sense or the classical sense, it's not necessarily the case. Now, finally, the other extreme of left wing libertarianism is right wing libertarianism, typically considered conservatives, okay? These individuals basically promote liberal, limited government, but they also emphasize strong capitalism. Their focus basically is limited government intervention in relation to specifically their economic gains, okay? So they're very much advocates of capitalism at the end of the day and being conservative with even the state's money, or particularly their own money, but their own money in relation to having to give it to the state, okay? Because, again, their focus is economic gains. So, thus, the freedom they're pushing for is economic freedom to earn as much as they wish with essentially limited interventions from the government, okay? So, these are all the various views and kind of a breakdown of libertarianism. And you can see how the big idea of freedom remains throughout each and every one of them. However, there's different variations to how that freedom plays out and how much government input is necessary based off the particular view. Now, let's take one last look at the most extreme version of Locke's idea, okay? Anarchism. Anarchism is basically the idea that the government is totally unnecessary and essentially problematic, okay? It's the idea that the people should have absolute negative liberties, meaning zero limits to doing as they wish. Now, this is an extreme view for a reason, because here's an example to show you how a true anarchist would basically view government oversight. So, a true anarchist would actually be against the government even regulating things like certifications or licensing to do certain jobs, okay? So, or specialized work. So, for example, if I wanted to, under this extreme view, pose as a dentist, even though I've never went to dentistry school, and tell people honestly that no, I don't have the same qualifications, but I've done my own research and I am willing to basically do any kind of dental work that you need, they would argue that it's my right to do so. Okay. Now, this being said, it should also be the other person's right to freely come to me for dental care, even like, for example, if I'm giving them a lower cost than a regular dentist, to come to me for dental care if they so wish. Okay. Again, under this idea, each individual is completely free to act as they wish without any government oversight, even if in this particular case it could do harm. Both individual parties are choosing for themselves to enter this contract as individuals within a society amongst each other versus the society itself saying you have to have this particular qualification in order to do this and get permission, if that makes sense. All right. So those are all the different variations. That being said, where do you stand, right? You now have a better understanding of how Locke's ideas basically grew into these bigger socio-political views, the different breakdowns. What do you think of libertarianism as a political stance? Do you agree with some of the assertions that you've heard, or do you have pushback? Think about these questions because this will essentially become important when you're considering how to set up your ideal society, which becomes the big assignment for this particular unit. Okay. All right. That being said, we are ready to move on to our next lecture. So, as usual, thank you so much for your time and please continue onward. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Take care.